How do we develop a robust, informative view of the global energy future? How do we account for the major changes the world is undergoing in technology, in geopolitics, in policy? My guests today are two of the smartest thinkers in how to do that, how to do it well, and I'm pleased that they're joining us in conversation. Please welcome Spencer Dale and Gareth Ramsay, both analysts at BP. They've recently published the 2025 BP Energy Outlook. We've talked to you guys about these products before. This is a familiar conversation. I'm delighted you're here today.
Great to be back, Joseph.
Spencer, so much has changed, it feels, in the last year, and yet the energy system is a slow-moving entity. So as you embark on another scenarios project, how have you adapted to today's conditions and set up the analysis for 2025?
Yeah, thank you. And we do it, we frame it in terms of these scenarios, and I have a slide which sort of just shows you the sort of the way we set up those scenarios. And so we have two main scenarios that we think about this year. One is that green current trajectory, and the idea of that current trajectory is it tries to capture the pathway the global energy system is moving along at the moment. It takes account of climate policies we see in action today.
Yep.
It takes account of all the pledges and aims that governments have set for the future, but it also takes account of the fact that governments will pledge an aim for some things, but it was a lot harder to deliver all those, so there's a degree of judgment underpinning that.
Yep.
And that's a story where carbon emissions sort of peak in this decade. They slowly decarbonise, but that pace of decarbonisation is slow and shallow. Carbon emissions by 2050 are only 25% below their current level. This is a pathway which is not consistent with maintaining temperature rises below 2 or anything like that.
Right.
And then we contrast that with a far faster, deeper decarbonisation pathway shown by that blue below 2 scenario. And the way to think of that below 2 scenario is a sort of like a what-if scenario. What would need to happen in the global energy system if the world wanted to reduce carbon emissions by around 90% by 2050? And they are the two scenarios we use to sort of frame this analysis. Now, the key thing, the one thing I know for certain, is the world won't materialise in exactly like any of those two scenarios. So those scenarios will be wrong.
Yeah.
We can't predict the future. We know we can't predict the future. So at this point, you're going, so why are BP spending all this money to produce these scenarios which are going to be wrong? Because the key point of producing these scenarios is not to contribute to the public debate, but the primary reason is to help BP make better decisions. And so how do we use them? And we spend quite a lot of time thinking about, can I see features and trends in the energy system which are common in both of those scenarios? So can I see features in the energy system which are common in that sort of green, slow, shallow pathway, decarbonisation pathway, and in that deep, rapid one?
Right.
And if I can see, so if wind and solar is growing exponentially quickly in that slow, shallow scenario, and it grows exponentially quickly in that deep decarbonisation scenario, I may have greater confidence that it will also grow exponentially quickly in a whole range of pathways between those blue and the green lines. And so in the Outlook itself, which is available on bp.com, we spend quite a bit of time at the beginning producing what we call these key insights. And the key insights are saying, what elements of the energy system are common to both, and therefore we can have some confidence they are likely to materialise, and which elements are very different in those two scenarios, and therefore for the role of low carbon hydrogen, it plays a very small role in that first case, in that green trajectory, but has a far bigger role in that more rapid case. And so then you think, if I'm thinking about low carbon hydrogen, part of my understanding here is it depends tremendously on that pace of decarbonisation. And by doing that, we then write down these sort of common trends and these differentiated trends, and we sit down with a senior management team in BP and say, we can't predict the future, but there's some elements in the energy system which we are sort of quite confident they are likely to materialise in some form or others. And there are other elements of the energy system which we know are highly dependent on the pace of the energy transition. And so that's how we use the energy scenarios to actually start making better decisions. Those scenarios there show you for the world. This one shows you for the US. So what does the pathway look like for the US? And that pathway for the US is on that current trajectory. We have carbon emissions falling by around 40% by 2050, so sort of falling shy of the sort of the
Sure.
NDCs that the US is committing
But
to.
the U.S. going to 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2050 would be about 40% of
About-
today's value, about
yeah.
half off of peak.
Yes, exactly.
And in that context, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but sort of where in 2050 in the sort of business as usual, where has the U.S., where has the world seen some decarbonization, and where does it continue to see emissions?
So for the US, a big part of that is sort of in these scenarios is a gradual decarbonisation of the power sector, and that's playing a big role. So essentially, we got wind and solar providing the dominant source of base load for wind and solar, and that has a sort of significant improvement. We're also, and we also see in the US, perhaps less than in some other parts of the world, a decarbonisation of the transportation system as well.
Yep.
Cars becoming more efficient, importantly. Cars also increasingly becoming electrified. If that electrification is going hand in hand with the decarbonisation of the power market, those two things really sort of work. If I can go back?
Yes, of course.
We also ask a question, what if I'm on the current trajectory and I'm sort of standing a lift with a policymaker and he says, I don't like being on this slow, shallow decarbonisation pathway.
Right.
I want to jump onto that rapid decarbonisation blue one. What really makes a difference? What things really make the difference? And we sort of do some analysis of that.
Yeah.
Two things really make the difference. One is decarbonising power markets in emerging markets.
Interesting.
That's critically. And then essentially it's decarbonising power markets, but in the developed world, in rich developed economies, that's sort of already happening in the pathway we're seeing at the moment. The real incremental impact is doing it in developing economies.
And in the context of your modeling, when you say decarbonize the power sector in emerging economies, does that mean what it means for developed economies, which means kind of closing, for instance, old coal plants and replacing those with a mixture of solar and batteries and wind and maybe some natural gas? Or is it developing energy access and higher levels of demand entirely with near zero carbon power systems? Those are two different tasks, one thinks.
Yeah, so, and the second task makes the first task so much harder. So if you're trying to decarbonise a power system where power demand has been flat for the last 10 or 20 years, and it may grow by, say, 2% a year going forward,
Right.
That's very different than if you're trying to decarbonise a power market where power demand is like to grow at 5 or 6% a year. And so it varies. So you'd need, it's a little bit building out wind and solar, but also it's also recognising that in some countries, you take, for example, India, we have some analysis in India. India's power demand over the next 10 years looks set to grow between 5 and 6% a year.
Yeah.
Even if they were to achieve their really, really ambitious targets for wind and solar, that still wouldn't be enough to even meet the growth of power demand. And so you'll need to see, almost in all situations, increase in coal-fired power generation in India. And so for India, the challenge is more, actually, you can't just say build more and more wind and solar and close down coal-fired power stations, because that won't work.
Right.
It's like, how do we help India use that coal in a more sustainable way? So then I think you have to start thinking about more efficient power stations, but you also then have to start thinking about carbon capture as well, because you can't, because the blueprints which work in developed economies where power demand is growing quite slowly don't work in countries where power demand is growing far more rapidly, and you can't take a Western blueprint and impose it on Asia.
Right. Well, and as you well know, we're starting to see this conflict in the United States as well, where growth in the power demand is starting to confront a lot of the implicit success we've had in reducing emissions in the power system over the past few years. I think we can touch on that in a minute. I want to stay global if we can for this portion of the conversation, because the point you just made, Spencer, about sort of needing all of the above resources to meet rapidly growing demand. It feels like the conversation globally is in a different place than it was 3 to 4 years ago, when the talk was phasing, not just arresting coal development, but phasing it down over time. This is what we were expecting to see from COP in Glasgow, as an example. Whereas in advance of this COP, that conversation is just not happening. And in the meantime, we've had enormous geopolitical changes. We have we're renegotiating by will of the American government the global trade environment. And countries are trying to figure out what their role in this new modern economy is. I know that you've spent some time thinking about that in the context of what these sort of geopolitical fracturing could mean for our energy system. I'd love to hear some of what this report says on that matter.
Yes, and let me start, and then Gareth may want to come in as well. The scenarios are framed around the pace of the energy transition, because sort of the single biggest uncertainty the energy system faces is that pace of the energy transition.
Certainly from the use case you talk about, that seems very important.
But there's so many other things are happening. And so one thing which we can see is geopolitical tensions are rising over the last few years. That's obviously, you can see that in terms of the war in Ukraine. We've seen over the last year increasing military conflicts in the Middle East, increasing use of trade sanctions, trade tariffs. And so the question posed potentially by my boss was, how do we think about geopolitical fragmentation, Spencer? How might that affect the energy system?
Yeah.
And so we wanted to spend some time thinking about that. And so we started by saying, let's just think about the different channels through which geopolitical fragmentation may work. And here I'm sort of doing it in a fairly narrow way. I'm saying, let's suppose geopolitical fragmentation makes countries more self-reliant and more concerned about energy security.
Yep.
How might that affect the world? And then we generate this this flow chart just to help your thinking. So the way to think about this flow chart, well, one channel, so let's look at the yellow lines first. So one is, if world becomes more self-reliant, then we'll see less global international trade.
Yep.
And what we know from economics is international trade tends to help promote economic growth.
Yep.
You can specialize in one thing, I can specialize in something else, and then we can trade. If you have a new technology, because I'm competing against you, that technology tends to diffuse quite quickly.
Yep.
And so international trade supports economic growth. So in a world where we have less economic growth, we have less international trade, we have slower economic growth, and then that feeds through into energy demand because the world's less big, it needs less energy.
Yep.
So that's the yellow channel in that flow chart. And then the other one is, well, the world just concerns more about energy security. How might that affect the world?
Right.
And then so if I worry about energy security, if I'm an importer of energy,
82% of the global population lives in a net importing country.
Fossil fuels, yeah.
In fossil fuels. Gareth and I are in China next week. They import 85% of their oil. They consume about half of their natural gas. A natural thing for them to do is say, well, I want to import less of that energy, so I want to reduce my oil, I want to reduce my natural gas. But at the same time, that similar argument holds for low carbon technologies. If I'm sitting in other parts of the world where I'm highly dependent on imports for critical minerals, for PV panels, for EV cars, I may say, actually, I want to become less reliant on those international supply chains and develop my own domestic supply chain, and that may come at a higher cost, which will then sort of slow the rate of that down. So that's the second thing I would do.
Fair to say that's exactly the situation the United States finds itself in right now.
Hold that thought. And then the third thing I'll do is I really want to double down on energy efficiency, because if I'm worried about energy security, the best thing I can do is just use less energy. So just be more efficient, energy productivity. And the fourth one, which may be less obvious, is I may place less weight on climate aims and climate goals. And that's that bottom bit of the chart there.
Yep.
And there's two arguments about why you may place less weight on climate goals. One is if you place more weight on energy security, you sort of got to have to place less weight on something else. We often frame this sort of thing in terms of the energy trilemma, trying to trade off security, sustainability, and affordability. If I'm increasing my weight on security, I have to sort of place less weight on something else. There's also a channel which is coming down from that top of the bar in terms of that GDP growth. If the world is growing less quickly, it's less prosperous. If it's less prosperous, then I may not be able to afford some of those decarbonisation pledges I've made, particularly for those expensive things. So low carbon hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, sustainable aviation fuel, they are high cost components, and I may just want to need to back off on those things. So we did this over the summer, and in the Outlook there's lots and lots of detail about how we try to go about calibrating all of these things and all the detailed modelling. but think about it. When we did all that work, we did it all over the summer, and then the team came back, and the punchline was, at a global level, it didn't shift things that much. Overall energy demand was lower because the world was less big,
Sure.
but the fuel mix hadn't really shifted very much. And we went, it's amazing, we spent all this time doing all this detailed work, and it didn't really seem to move the dial. Have we just been wasting our time? And then we realised, no, that's not the way to think about it. What it's doing is it affects different countries in very different ways.
Right.
One country behaves in one way, one country behaves in a different way, and they tend to net out. So what you've got to do is look at this at a country level. So if you look at China, as I was saying, for China next year and next week, what do? They say, well, I want to import less oil and gas. So what do I try to do? Then I try to electrify my economy as quickly as possible. I want to double down on those low carbon technologies because I'm the world's leading producer of those low carbon technologies. So what am I doing? I'm electrifying my economy with low carbon power and with coal because I can produce my coal domestically. And so I start to see this emergence of sort of an electrostate on one side. On the other side, suppose I'm in America and going, well, I'm an oil and gas exporter. I want to maximize that comparative advantage I have. So I then use that oil and natural gas, but I don't want to have my dependency, increase my dependency on those international supply chains for low carbon energy. So I may back off of some of those components and then sort of have a completely different story. And so what this led us to believe was sort of increased geopolitical fragmentation leads to increased energy differentiation.
Right.
And when you say it, you go, yeah, of course that's true, Spencer. But it's one of those, sometimes you need to do a lot of work to sort of see how that all came about. And so for a company like us, so my answer to my boss was, this may not affect global markets too much. But what we really have to understand is that the needs of our businesses in one part of the world may be behaving very differently to the needs of our business in another part of the world. And I think for more generally for people, when they think about energy security, they will often think about energy security through the prism of their own domestic country. But that will often be very different to how another person in another country will be thinking about it. And so part of this is just to have an awareness that energy security to an average American may mean something very different to energy security to an average Indian or an average Chinese person. And so you can't project from where you are to how other people may be thinking.
Well, let me ask you just one follow-up question in this context. You know, BP's a European company coming from the UK. Europe has most recently experienced a significant energy security shock. How do those dynamics play out in Europe, in your view?
So I think Europe's a really good example of exactly Spencer's point and this question that as we talk and think about fragmentation, we really need to ground ourselves in where we are and where people find themselves. And in Europe, of course, is in the classic situation, quite like China, in that it is exposed to fossil fuel imports and it has this strong incentive, which I think people have been talking about for a while now. Its domestic energy source is renewables, and it has this, it gives it a more fragmented world, does increase that incentive to speed up its renewables build out and electrify its economy. But where it's different to China is it is exposed to those Chinese supply chains. And so Europe does face that difficult trade-off of it is not self-reliant in fossil fuels, but it also finds itself having to face the challenge of dependence on supply chains for low carbon technology, which is a restraining force on the otherwise natural answer, which is surely the answer for Europe, is simply to grow your renewables and electrify everything. But it does throw this extra complication in for a place like Europe. It finds itself straddling those two worlds. And it's only really when we did this modelling bottom up that we found fascinating differences in the paths that different regions are going to take. And I think it does just bring it back to that point that when you think about fragmentation, it's obvious when you do the analysis, but this just feels very different according to which part of the world you find yourself looking at it from.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, from the United States perspective, we're relatively comfortable in production of oil and natural gas. That gives us a lot of leeway to probably make mistakes in our energy strategy, to have fits and starts when it comes to decarbonization. Europe clearly is not in the same position, neither the developing countries or India or China. And so watching, how global institutions respond to that fracturing, I think is like probably a conversation for another day, but one I'm very excited to follow over the coming years. One issue that you raise in the context of fracturing is the reduction that comes from GDP growth. And if you imagine a world where the geopolitical fracturing is causing countries to want to not just secure their own supply chain or value chain for energy, but for a variety of other goods. Ongoing in the U.S., we have efforts to reshore manufacturing to this country, or to friendshore was the language used by the Biden administration, to sort of kind of build more diversified supply chains. Now, from an economic standpoint, this can read as highly inefficient, right? Because you're not taking advantage of comparative advantages and trade. I think it also may have implications for energy, because you're building a larger, less economically efficient supply chain. Suddenly the US needs to think about not just how are we going to power data centers, but how are we going to power semiconductor manufacturing? And how are we going to power aluminum smelting? And this report takes a look at that question of kind of how much energy do we need, but it does it in the context of energy efficiency. So I'd love to hear kind of how you're thinking about energy efficiency trends, how you define them in the context of this outlook, and what it means for what the global energy forecast is going to be. Like, how much primary energy does the world need?
Thank you. And this, our sort of interest in energy efficiency was started a bit by a puzzle. Mm-hmm. And the puzzle was, I think we've spoken about it in the past, Joseph, and you speak to anybody in this energy space and say, how do you think the world's doing in terms of the energy transition? And I think most people go, well, the pace of energy transition has been quite disappointing over the last few years. Oil, gas, natural gas, coal continue to increase. It's increased by more than we expected, so that's suggesting the transition is slower than we thought. But the puzzle is, but at the same time, the world has actually surprised on the upside in terms of the amount of low carbon energy it's producing and using. Wind and solar has surprised to the upside. The IEA estimate that this year the world will invest $2.2 trillion in low carbon energy. That's up 70% in 5 years. It's double the amount of investment in fossil. Did the world really think we was going to invest more than 70%? So how do I square this thing?
Yeah.
Low carbon energy is growing as quick or quicker than I expected, but oil and gas and coal are still growing by more.
It's a world of energy addition, Spencer.
In a world, indeed, which we spoke about a year ago. And then in a world where global GDP growth has been at best lackluster.
Yeah.
And the answer is, it's energy efficiency. And so let me explain what I mean by energy efficiency. So this chart shows, so the blue line here just shows you the annual change in energy efficiency measured in terms of total final energy consumption. So in the past, the energy efficiency has moved about 2% a year. So what that means is each year you could produce the same amount of output, goods and services, with 2% less energy.
Sure.
And so over time, we can the economy can produce more and more goods with less energy. Over the last 5 years, that we've had some particularly weak levels of energy efficiency in 2020, but also in 23 and 24. So that's an average energy efficiency over the last 5 years has averaged about 1.5%. So why? So how does that square the puzzle? The puzzle means is because we've had less energy efficiency, we've just been consuming more of all types of energy.
And just as a matter of definition, a 0.5% change can feel small.
Yeah.
But you should think about this like labor productivity, right? You're multiplying a small percentage by an enormous number, which is final primary energy consumption. And so the growth rate here really does matter in outlook.
So that's exactly what we wanted to sort of explore and ask that question. So in our current trajectory, remember that green pathway I showed you, the slow, shallow decarbonisation pathway, we actually model energy efficiency from a bottom up. So we take a view on the transportation system, the types of cars people are using, industry and so on. But the pathway that it looked like was shown by that green line. So that's what it looked like from when we sort of put it all together. And so the story you would tell is that weakness that we've seen in the last couple of years gradually dissipates and it goes back to its trend level by around 2030. So you can see that green line, it sort of gradually doesn't immediately go back, it gradually gets back to the trend level and then sort of stays there going forward. But we don't know why energy efficiency's been so weak. We don't really have a good explanation. There's some possible theories about the nature of industrial production in some countries, increasing levels of extreme weather events. So if it's very hot, people have to turn on their air conditioning. They don't produce any more output, they just have to turn on their air conditioning.
They have to spend to maintain output.
Indeed, exactly. And so we just say, let's suppose, we don't try and, so suppose energy efficiency just stays weak for 5 more years.
Right.
And then goes back to its trend level. So let's just look, what would that do on that red line? So that's the alternative pathway. It's just as a thought experiment.
Yeah.
And to show you, to give you one number about why that, so that's not that big a deal. Nobody really looks at energy efficiency and it's still going back by 2035. Who really cares? Right. What does that do for oil demand? So in that current trajectory, oil demand in 2035 in the green line, in that green pathway, is pretty much unchanged from its level today. So it goes up a bit, then down a bit, but big picture, oil demand is in 2035 unchanged to today. In this alternative scenario, in that red line, oil demand is 5.5 million barrels higher. Okay, so just this one small change completely transforms your nature of what you think is going to happen to oil markets over that period. You see similar proportionate increases in natural gas, similar proportionate increases in coal. And so this sort of thing, which sounds really quite techie and nerdy, has had a really profound impact on the nature of the energy transition over the last 5 years. Right. And could have enormous implications for the pace of particularly energy demand and particularly fossil fuel demand over the coming 10 years. I
think this is, from an analyst standpoint, one of the most important things that we should be thinking about right now in terms of global energy outlook. And the reason why I am keyed in on this question is that if we think AI is going to lead to an increase of the global growth rate of 0.5%, 1%, then our ability to fuel that growth more energy efficiently or not is a huge determinant of how much energy we're going to need 5 years, 10 years hence. The growth rates here seem to matter immensely. And your oil example is a perfect one. It's like 5% adjustment on the global.
Could I just make 2 points on that? Because I think it's a very deep point.
You're welcome to make 3 if you like.
I will stop at 2. I think, as Spencer's described, the first lesson from this is more people should be thinking more about energy efficiency. Yeah. If you want to think about the future and understand this. But your second point is a very interesting and relevant one, which I also think people are not thinking about enough, which is if one of the things fueling economic growth and energy demand and causing it to accelerate is going to be technology, machine learning, that actually should, and I think could, be a really powerful tool for helping us to optimize our energy systems. And actually, one of the very natural applications of some of this technology ought to be to helping us address exactly this challenge. Machine learning is very well adapted and very well suited for optimizing complicated systems. And if it could help us to actually get us back to that dotted line more quickly, actually we might find that AI is having impacts on the energy system that go well beyond just data centers and power demand, and may actually be a really powerful tool in helping us to address this challenge.
I'm glad you raised that. Interested members of the audience might like to check out our paper from September we published here at CSIS on AI tools for the grid, where we make a similar argument, thinking about what is available now, what has been demonstrated but not yet scaled in deployment that can help address that challenge in the U.S. So that we use.
And I want to say, it even goes beyond the grid. We as a company are now applying machine learning and these technologies to help us in exploration, in production, to operate our facilities more efficiently. So actually, I think that technology could address both the grid challenges that I'm sure you talk about in your paper, but also others around the energy system too.
And I'll use this vocabulary with you two because I know you two can handle it. If you take the partial derivative, right, of this sort of product of GDP and BTUs per GDP, it matters both where the GDP growth is and where the energy growth is. And one of the things I think we need to get a better understanding of is, so how much are those two going to be correlated? How much is this a technology growth story versus a broader economic story? If the world gets rich off AI and we all start flying around more, that's a different challenge than powering data centers.
Absolutely.
And what that conversation just demonstrated really clearly is the questions raised by AI are immense.
Yes.
And they're almost not related at all to how much power AI will use in data centers over the next 5 or 10 years.
Right.
So much volume inches, column inches are focusing on AI and demands for data centers to support AI and the impacts on power. That's important, and really important in a country like the US. But the implications of AI for the global energy system over the next 20 or 30 years are just so much orders of magnitude more important in terms of the questions that you and Gareth are raising.
Right.
What does this do for economic growth?
Yep.
And what does it do for the ability to support that in terms of energy efficiency and energy production? And that was sort of one of the messages we tried to convey in the Outlook.
Interesting. Maybe you can return to that, because I think there's some very interesting, deep questions about that. But since you raised AI data centers, you know and are well familiar with this being a big issue in the United States right now. We are the world center for advanced AI labs. The US companies are the biggest investors in accelerated semiconductors. We're building these enormous data centers. That has reasserted the role of natural gas in our power system. At the same time, we're expanding greatly our ability to export LNG. It's a huge priority of this administration, both in terms of its permitting actions, but as well as negotiating trade deals. One of the things we've talked about before is the future outlook for US gas. And I know that that's been another area of focus in the report. Maybe we could hear a little bit about what you're thinking there.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's more, I think I have a question more than a answer. So what this is, this sort of bridge chart, and it's sort of, the way, what that sort of says is so today, so the blue line shows the natural gas production today, which is in the US, which is a little over 1,000 BCM, and that increases by about 20% out to 2035 in current trajectory. So this is sort of small picture, the pathway we're on at the moment. So sort of not, sort of not a bad guide to what may happen. That growing by around 20%. Half of that natural gas demand goes into the power sector. Yep. And within power, if I look within power, that growth within US power demand in this scenario, about 40% is data centers, that's the little pink bar, and then the rest of it is all other parts of power demand going into industry, particularly buildings and transport. And so half of this gas going into the power sector to essentially meet this accelerating growth that we all are seeing in US power demand. And then half of it, the other half, going into LNG exports. US LNG exports set to rise by about 2.5-fold out to 2035. So there's a huge expansion in US LNG exports. And I guess the question, Joseph, which you're closer to being able to the answer, so I'll switch it round, will there actually over time, is there a risk that these two things start to become in conflict with each other? Can we see accelerating use of natural gas in the power system to drive the power supply needed to support the increasing electrification of the US economy and the data centers, and at the same time, this rapid expansion of LNG exports into the rest of the world? And at some point, is there a sort of a risk that they start to compete with each other? And sort of that sort of is, we don't have an answer to that in the Outlook, but our scenarios at least pose that question.
I think it's a reasonable question, and there's sort of three considerations that I think fall into my answer, which is going to be non-definite. On the one hand, we expect there to be price competition, right? There's no way from a sort of baseline economic principles standpoint that you have portfolio players exporting LNG, and that's not going to raise at 2.5 times the volume present, and that's not going to have an upward price pressure. And at the same time, expanding the role of gas to meet data center and other electricity demand is clearly going to occur. These are not the growth rates we saw in the 2000s, but it's a substantial element of new growth in the power sector. They have to compete on price. So the big question is, how flat is the production curve?
Yeah.
How durable is production going to be in the U.S. and do we have the sort of pipeline infrastructure and other storage infrastructure to help maintain that? So I personally would expect to see domestic gas prices in the U.S. rise over this period. That will spur enough production more toward the dry gas than associated to help meet all this demand. I don't know that I predict a political crisis around that. But I would expect to see prices go up.
The market will do what the market does.
Yeah. The cure for high prices is high prices. Yeah. The challenge, I think, is actually going to be more on the infrastructure side. Right. You know, we've expanded gas consumption, if you include LNG, 40% over the last 15 years, I think, roughly speaking. Our storage facilities have not grown at all. And so as our power sector becomes more gas dependent, especially with respect to coal, we really do need to, I think, from a security standpoint, invest more in infrastructure. Otherwise, we might not get sort of secular price rises, but high volatility that would cause problems. And the last bit, you know, today's administration is very gas forward. They see this as the exports as being good for our economy, being good for our geopolitics. Many see them as being potentially good for the climate, depending on what gas resources are offsetting elsewhere. You know, how durable that is to future political change is a question, because in the Biden administration, the sort of global emissions impact of gas was a big issue. It's no secret that the U.S. sits atop an enormous resource. I suspect we'll use it. And the big questions to me are, how do our politics accommodate that with respect to climate? And then in the 2030s, you know, what's gas going to be competing with in the power sector and other places?
So for us to understand this, we need to track A, how your infrastructure build out is going, and B, how you're voting.
I think so. I think both of those will matter quite a bit. Right. And then, of course, we'll have to realize how real all this expected data center demand is. We've touched on a lot. There's a lot in this report. It's hard to model the global energy system. One of the things I really appreciate and admire about BP is you do this annually, and you iterate and self-correct and raise new issues. What else is in here that the reader should pay attention to?
You go first, or
well, no, I'll take you the first one.
I think two things have changed dramatically. One we've sort of focused is energy security over the last couple of years has just increased enormously in the West. Interestingly, in the East, it's always been important. So every time we go to Beijing, every time we go to Delhi, they've always been talking to us about energy security for the last 10 years. And so they scratch their heads about why are you changing so much? And they're saying, well, because we're catching up with where you were. And we'd forgotten, I think, quite a lot of about the importance of energy security. I think the other thing which is sort of quite interesting is just the pace of change which is happening in China, I think, over the last few years is really quite striking. So I think on the day we launched the Energy Outlook in London in September, China announced its new climate targets, and its climate targets was to reduce carbon emissions from their peak level, and wherever peak level is, but it looks like peak level is around nowish, by between 7.5% and 10% by 2035. So in the next 10 years, to reduce carbon emissions by around 7.5%, 10%. What was interesting is everybody's reaction to that was, why so little? China, again, this is not that stretching a target. And indeed, in our current trajectory, the pathway the world is currently moving along is something like sort of closer to sort of 15, 16% a year. So, but the point here is, I think 5 years ago, we weren't thinking about China's carbon emissions peaking. But that peak means, what does that mean? It means essentially peak coal. It means also oil also likely to be close to reaching a plateau and starting to decline. And so that's that pace of change, I think, in China as it adopts, I think in the most recent data, 60% of the solar panels which were installed in 23 were in China. 65% of the wind turbines, 60% of the EVs that were sold were in China. over 25% of new nuclear capacity was in China. So its adoption of clean energy, at the same time as continuing to increase coal as well, because it needs more of all energy, I think has been quite striking. And I think, I haven't actually done the analysis, but my hunch is our view of that pace of change in China has been one of the biggest thing, not just in the last year, but over sort of the last 5 or 10 years. So since I've been doing this role, I think it's been quite
And I hear in that context both economic and geopolitical drivers.
Yes.
Security and the sort of falling cost of renewables, I think, makes it very quick and easy to build there.
I think it's geopolitical, it's energy security. Interesting, I think it's also industrial policy. So for many years, I think when we go to China, I think when I was speaking to officials and industrial leaders, they would say, it is very hard for us to ever to be able to compete with the West in terms of producing internal combustion engine cars. So the West is just so much better than us. We're never going to be able to do that. So let's really push hard on electric vehicles. Electric vehicles help because they reduce our dependency on oil imports, but they also give us this industrial policy where we can actually compete in those types of technologies.
Yeah.
So I think it's all of those things pushed in the same direction.
Yeah, that's a big part of the economic plan too, right? President Xi has been very clear. Construction and export of, or excuse me, manufacture and export of EVs, of batteries, solar panels, electricity components is a primary vector of their economic planning.
And I think it will be very interesting. Actually, we know that the plenum is now under development at the moment, and I think one thing we should all be looking out for is what the next stage of that industrial and energy plan is. I think they will already be talking and communicating about their next set of priorities, and I think if China's transformation over the last 15 years has been the big thing that we have learned from, I think also we should be looking very closely at which technologies and energy vectors they are moving to next.
But it does all go back to that geopolitical fragmentation story we were talking about, that flow chart. If you think about that flow chart says a challenge for America is some of the markets in which they currently sell and export their oil and gas may be less keen to take their oil and gas because of the energy security that raises.
Yep.
But the same challenge is for China is some of the markets in which they're currently exporting all their low carbon technologies may be saying, actually, we're less keen to take those technologies because of the energy security that poses, and we're going to develop our own domestic supply chain. So in that sense, how that sort of story, that growth strategy that China has is adopting, which I fully agree with, how easy it will be to implement that will be a function quite importantly on how big these energy security issues become over time.
Right, and I ask you, in the actions we've seen even over the last month of saying exporting of critical minerals or components that have critical minerals is going to face new tests, new potential export bans. All of that redoubts to climate technologies because of the efficient magnets and battery technologies that are invoked in the new Chinese policies. Fascinating area to watch. Gareth, one thing that the reader should check that we haven't already addressed.
I suppose one last thing I would add is we used to, like many energy modelers, divide the world into developed and emerging economies.
Yep.
As we've just been discussing, I think the big learning of the last 5 to 10 years is that's not right.
Right.
You need to talk about developed economies, emerging economies, and China. And I think we are now learning increasingly that you need to think about developed economies, emerging economies, China, and India.
Right.
And I think we are all going to need to learn more and focus more and think more about India's energy demand. It's going to be by far the largest growth market for energy. It will face its own energy security challenges and its own sustainability challenges, which are probably going to rise in importance and profile. So I think we talk more, I suspect, about India in this outlook than we ever have before. And I think we and others will find ourselves talking more about India in the future too.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to these future conversations. I want to thank you both for joining us today, and thank you for the hard work that you do each and every year, trying to help not just your company, but all of us understand better what the future of energy may be for our countries and for our world.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess.
Colleagues, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Joseph Majkut, Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS, signing off.